Hey everybody. So we are in our Middle Ages unit, which means we're talking about Europe during the Middle Ages. It was basically at the fall of Rome, and before what's known as the Renaissance or the modern age is the Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages or the medieval times. And there's a few things that really are going to stand out. One thing that we're definitely going to be talking about is there was a lot of conflict and a lot of human rights issues. So we're going to be talking about those things a lot. So the first thing you guys researched yesterday was the idea of feudalism. And the idea behind feudalism is it is a system of government and an economic system in which the wealthy own the land. So the king would then give land to the barons, and then the barons would give land to the lords, and then the lords would run the land right, on their manor, and they'd have the peasants, the poor people, work for them. The idea with this system was the wealthy, the landowners, would provide protection and as well as a place for the poor people to live and to grow food. And in return, the poor people would grow food for the wealthy people. Now, the good thing about this is it gave protection and land for poor people, and for the wealthy people, it gave them they had all this land, they needed people to farm it. But the bad thing is in feudalism is you're born into whatever social class you are in, and you basically are stuck in it. So the idea is if you are a king, your children will be royalty, nobles, right? And the same thing with the barons and the lords. They'll all be lords and nobles, and their kids will be lords and nobles, and so on and so on. Same thing is true if you're a peasant. So if you're a peasant, you're born a peasant, you'll live a peasant, and you'll die a peasant for the most part. You might possibly be able to move up to become a more skilled peasant, like a merchant or a blacksmith. But for the most part, whatever you're born in is what you are going to stay in. And so the problem with feudalism is there's no real social mobility like you could in ancient Egypt, where you could work yourself up and improve your life. In Middle Ages, basically whatever you're born as is what you'll stay as. And so that's definitely what we consider to be a human rights issue, which a lot of you guys got right on your worksheet yesterday. And then the bonus cool points question was we were looking for villas or domus, is what the manor is like, basically a big, huge mansion, right? Now, what the manor eventually turned into, which is what you're looking at today, is the idea of the castle. Now, the castle, again, would be another perfect example of a human rights issue because only really the wealthy got the castles. Now, I know in the reading it mentioned that, oh, yes, well, the wealthy can, the poor people would be able to go in there in time of attack. But when you look at the size of some of these castles and then the amount of peasants living around the castle, simply wouldn't have fit. So the idea is in times of war, the king would have been safe, the lord would have been safe in the castle, not necessarily all of the peasants around them. And going back to the idea of feudalism, one of the things that you guys did in your introduction to the Middle Ages is you talked about how a lot of you guys would choose to be villagers because you didn't want to be responsible for protecting the land and the king, right? But there's something you guys didn't really think about. The king is going to lead the army. Who do you think is going to make up the soldiers in the king's army? Exactly, the villagers, the peasants. So a lot of these peasants that were, serving the king for protection ended up having to protect the king when it was a war, right? And so there's definitely this idea of unfair ideas in feudalism. And then when we look back at the castles, you can see how the idea of how they change over time, going from wooden to stone, and then eventually stopped being made when they were inventions like gunpowder that could knock down the stone walls, and that kind of made castles what's called obsolete or no longer useful. But castles would certainly be a great example of technology as well as also human-environment interaction. So hopefully you enjoyed learning about feudalism and castles, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.